find something that you care about, whether it's done well, and you can tell whether it's done well. If you have those two things, then you will be motivated to learn whatever you need to learn to make it good, and you'll be able to iterate because you can tell whether it's good. If you don't have either of those things, then you're screwed because you can't tell if you're making progress.
Episode 17. Our guest is Glenn MacDonald, who is Spotify's data alchemist. We're taking a critical look at the effectiveness of algorithms and why GenAI probably isn't the best technology for many of your problems.
I think the main thing I've learned is actually not to think about it as prediction. The moment you start thinking about it as prediction, you've sort of internalized the sort of ugly idea that the future is kind of determined and you're just attempting to guess what it's going to be. What you want is them helping you do your things. And instead, what you've got is a thing that is helping the business accomplish the business things.
Glenn MacDonald is a music evangelist, algorithm designer, software engineer, and technology strategist. He created the music exploration website Every Noise at Once, and for 12 years was the data alchemist at the Echo Nest and Spotify. He's written about music online since before blog was a word, and his first offline book, You Have Not Yet Heard Your Favorite Song, How Streaming Changes Music, is on Canterbury Press.
Like every shiny new toy, it's like, this is amazing. We can use it on everything. And then a while later, you know what? A microwave is amazing, and we don't have to cook everything with a microwave. Like, we have microwaves, but there's still things that are good to put in skillets or in ovens or put on a stick and hold over a fire.
In this episode, we discuss the secret to successful algorithmic playlists at Spotify, why you must be able to evaluate the effectiveness of GenAI, what's at risk when you're taking on GenAI projects, GenAI is often not the right solution for your problem, and ways of optimizing GenAI outputs.
Thank you for listening to the Design of AI podcast. We interview leaders and practitioners at the forefront of AI. If you like this episode, please remember to leave a rating and to follow us on your favorite podcast app. Well, Glenn, first of all, thank you so much for joining us today. We're very excited about this conversation.
My pleasure.
So you've been called Spotify's data guru and their data alchemist. And your project, Every Noise at Once, mapped the endless complexity of music categorization. Can you decrypt what you've been working on for the last decade? Nice, simple question to get us started.
Yeah, well, there was actually a job description in the Spotify HR system called Data Alchemist. There wouldn't have been if I hadn't arrived with the Echo Nest acquisition with that as my funny title. And my official responsibility was to explore what was possible to make out of listening data. We had 200 million or 300 million or something. By the end, there were 500 or 600 million people listening for, hours every day. And that's a lot of data. And so it seemed pretty safe to assume there was stuff that we could make out of that. So I got to, for a long time, experiment with what that stuff might be. And for me, as a music fan and a curious person about how the world works and what's going on, the goal of that was always to find out the answers to those questions. Like, what other music is there? I've long said that I live in the paralyzing fear that there's great music out there that I haven't heard yet. And I'm desperately trying to find it before I die. And it turns out I've only become more sure of that after 10 years of exploring music data and music. There's amazing music everywhere. Everywhere I look, I'm like, oh, that's a cool, odd band. And then 10 minutes later, I'm like, oh, there's 200 more of those bands. That's a whole scene. To somebody, that's normal music. And it's only strange and novel because I'm from somewhere else and I never heard it before.
But isn't it so transformative what Spotify and streaming has been capable to do of bringing new sounds to the forefront? And you could go down these rabbit holes that are endless. It's magical. And that's why your Every Noise at Once site was a fantastic compendium through which to explore different sounds and subgenres and sub-subgenres.
Yeah, I definitely believe that. And that's basically the premise of my book, too, which is that bringing all this music online together, connected, is it doesn't make technical sense to say that it's a bigger cultural development than the internet itself, because obviously the internet is a superset of that. But it feels that way to me. Like the internet without all the music online was cool. Like it was amazing to have all this information accessible, and I was impressed that I could go online and download Gary Newman's discography and know which albums I was missing. But when we got to the point where actually all the music was online as opposed to all the files about what the music was, then I really felt like we changed something profound.
I'm really a fan of looking back in history and seeing, what are the precedents for now. And in many respects, it's what you were doing is discovering languages that have yet to be collected or documented, or the same way that a naturalist would go and find new species of things. Obviously, the locals knew all about it, but this is a matter of collecting them all. And languages don't evolve as quickly as music does. Music is the most ephemeral type of language in the world. So again, it must have been quite an adventure, right?
I totally was. And I think when I started, I sort of thought I was discovering things. There's this inherent sort of colonialist hubris in the idea of discovering that somehow those things didn't really matter until we arrived, the knowledgeable ones, and discovered them. And at some point, and I thought of myself as like a knowledgeable music geek when I began this. And at some point very early in the process, I had this software that when we started categorizing genres, and I had this software that I called the genre miner that would wander around in the data structures looking for clusters of artists that were related to each other by shared audience, but weren't tagged in our system yet. And some of those would be real and some of them wouldn't, because the data was weird at the time. So the miner would surface these clusters for me to look at. And sometimes I'd look at them and go, I don't know what this is. And sometimes it'd be really obvious from the names that there was a thing. And so one day it came up with this set of names, and they were all name name, or name ampersand name. I'm like, all right, is that Portuguese? I don't know what that is. It's some Latin language. They're all duos. Must be some odd scene that I never heard of. And 10 minutes of internet research later, I realized it's this thing called sertanejo. It's like country music of Brazil. It is the most beloved music for 100 million people. And I, thinking of myself as a knowledgeable music person, basically never heard of it. At that point, I realized, okay, I just have to let go of this idea that I know that my catalog of factual knowledge is my claim to have the right to participate in this. I just don't know. The world is broad. Assume that there are things that are just totally normal to millions of people that I've never heard of. And that allowed me to just reset and realize I'm not discovering things. I'm helping the music world self-organize. I'm helping these communities, which exist and are real and don't rely on me for that, to project themselves through this listening data to themselves, to more listeners, to potential audiences elsewhere. It's not discovery, it's facilitation.
So, not to oversimplify things, but if we were to look 10 years in the future, your role, your focus, your drive, your outcomes, is that what a music AI agent should be trying to replicate?
AI is in a very funny place where it seems obvious that it has a massive amount of potential, and we don't really yet know what to do with that. And that's a normal state of all technology. Like every shiny new toy, it's like, this is amazing. We can use it on everything. And then a while later, you're like, you know what? A microwave is amazing, and we don't have to cook everything with a microwave. Like we have microwaves, but there's still things that are good to put in skillets or in ovens or put on a stick and hold over a fire. My theory, current theory, all provisional, is that AI is going to be another great tool if we can keep ourselves from screwing it up by forgetting that it's a tool. As long as we realize and remember that, like all these things, going back to math and SQL queries, which is what most of my work at Spotify actually boiled down to in a technical sense, They all exist to extend human powers, human interests, curiosity, initiative. They don't have motivations of their own. People talk about what the algorithm wants. There's rarely the algorithm, but even if there were, it doesn't want anything. It doesn't have that power, has no soul, has no goals. And I think there's a lot of tech company inertia to treat the technology as the thing. And the technology is never the thing. The people are the thing. And every new technological tool goes through this painful iteration of pretending it's the thing, and then eventually we rein it in and realize, oh, it's like a lever. It's a very fancy lever. The lever doesn't have a goal about what it's going to lift or move or turn over. It just exists to be put in our hands and let us move something. We're at the idiot stage where we're just mesmerized by our levers and think that they will lead us. They will move all the things for us, and they will decide what to move. And they're not going to do that.
And I wonder if that's why we are all in this phase of like wanting to anthropomorphize it so much. But not to get too much onto that, you were so heavily involved in what was happening with Spotify. And then obviously the end of Spotify came very suddenly for you and a lot of really amazing people who worked there. You know, we have worked on some projects with Spotify, and a lot of the amazingly intelligent people that we worked with were so integral to that and are no longer there. So what drew you to then sort of shift from that to now working for an AI startup?
Well, I certainly assumed after I got laid off that I would find a new music job to sort of keep doing the work that I was doing, which I didn't think was done. I don't know that I would have ever thought it was done. And so I spent a bunch of months talking to pretty much everybody at every level of the music industry, and basically sorted all the things into two big groups. There were a lot of very interesting, principled, idealistic startups trying to rebuild some broken part of the music industry in some better way. And there's no shortage of broken parts of the music industry that could stand to be reinvented that way. And almost all of those seemed certain to fail. Individually, almost all of them almost certainly will fail. Some of them won't. Very hard to guess which ones won't. And then on the other side, there were a lot of very established large companies that almost definitely weren't going to immediately fail, but that it was hard to be sure that there was really room to do interesting things. And as I was juggling those, waiting for either a crazy, interesting idea to become viable or a viable landing spot to become clearly interesting, I was like, what else could I be doing? And my two main candidates were help alleviate global climate crisis or help avert the AI apocalypse. And I decided not to be a physics major back in 1985. So I wish I had something that could contribute to the climate situation, but I kind of don't. But the use of AI, I felt like, all right, that's a kind of problem I'm used to dealing with. What do we do with these tools? How do we understand what's possible with them and how they serve human goals instead of subduing them? And a random AI company happened along while I'm sorting through all these other things, and we're like, hey, would you consider working with us? I'm like, yes, I would consider it. What are you doing? And so that turned out to be an interesting thing to do next. I think I initially was skeptical. So I'm like, and then I'm sure these people know all these things about AI, and I've been writing SQL queries and arguing against machine learning for 10 years. And how's that going to work? But as soon as I get into it, I realized that's the same problems. Like, I might as well just call myself an alchemist at both jobs. The goals are the same. Like, putting technology in between human beings or intervening in human culture in some way, and that could be good or bad. And in order to understand which it is, we have to be able to understand the human processes that we're dealing with and what happens to them and how we evaluate results and how our ability to evaluate results influences what we choose to do. Once I realized that, this is good too. And I felt, having written a book and published it in this weird old world of paper publishing, that I sort of had an obligation to help prevent the complete dissolution of the information world by running it all through AI and producing AI nonsense.
And to that point, whether it's ML or AI, it seems like these tools fundamentally are there to improve the predictions of what people want. It seems ultimately that's really what we're trying to craft in some form.
I think the main thing I've learned is actually not to think about it as prediction. I think the thing that happens to you when you start thinking about things as prediction, and I think this applies to thinking about LLM outputs as predicting text. It also applies to A&R and music as like predicting hit artists. The moment you start thinking about it as prediction, you've sort of internalized the sort of ugly idea that the future is kind of determined and you're just attempting to guess what it's going to be and thus profit by anticipation. And I think it's a lot more productive to not think about the future as something you're predicting, but as something you're making. And this is sort of a phrasing, like a linguistic point, because you could talk about the same things as prediction or production, but it changes how you think about it. If you talk to an artist, if you talk to like a label and they're trying to guess who the big artists are going to be, that tells a story about how they go about things. And if instead they are trying to figure out how to build careers, that's a very different story. It's the same all the ways through all technology. You think about what you're doing with AI as, all right, what am I trying to make different in the future?
This Design of AI episode is brought to you by PH1, a research and strategy consultancy that helps clients build AI products that customers want. Contact them about product discovery research to answer critical questions about what to build, competitive analysis to find out how to gain an advantage, service and customer analysis to identify the best use cases and value drivers, and workshops and concept testing to validate what will work and to fine-tune products. PH1 has worked on products for Spotify, Microsoft, the National Football League, Dell, Mozilla, Bell, and various health and higher education groups. Bring in an expert to make sure your products and teams are focused on what customers want. Visit their website to book an intro call, ph1.ca.
So maybe
Okay.
you could walk us through your point of view from the perspective of an algorithmic playlist. What do you view as the role of delivering to a user an algorithmic playlist, whether it's a daily mix or the weekly mix? What was your point of view on that?
So the goal for me is doing something for the listener that the listener wants but would have trouble doing themselves. So Daily Mix, which was originally my thing, we implemented it at RDO at the Alchemist before we got acquired by Spotify, and then we did it in a better version at Spotify. The goal of that was recognizing that people's taste is rarely singular. Like most people like a bunch of different things and they like them in different ways and they use them in different ways in their life. And most people would find it tedious to manually construct that taxonomy for themselves. But we had enough data that we could try to do it for them. So that was the goal of Daily Mix, is organize your catalog of listening in the way you would if you had time and initiative to, but you probably don't. It wasn't to recommend things, it was just to do this useful thing for you. And having done that, then it's possible to say, all right, well, having found these are the blues artists you like, separate from the black metal artists you like, then it's possible to say, oh, and now that I've collected those 20 blues artists, here are 20 more blues artists that are not only just blues artists, but the kinds of blues artists that you like. Like, there's no reason you need to like those too. The ways in which they're similar may not be the ways that you care about, but at least it's useful to put them there and say, you might consider these. It might be interesting and useful to you to have these given to you as opposed to trying to find them yourself by navigating through 20 artists. Fans also like lists and writing down notes on a piece of paper.
Well, maybe let's take the analogy and move it over to something that LLMs are being leveraged for, which is ad tech. And let's keep the analogy of music. Brittany and I, some of the projects we worked on were for Spotify for Artists. So it's the platform for which artists leverage to collect analytics and inform decisions. Now, one of the dilemmas we always had in that project was if an artist isn't trained on how to understand or manipulate data, they tend to make uninformed decisions based off that data and often are actualizing their own biases rather than anything factual because usually they don't have a frame of reference. Usually they're unsure how to monetize things appropriately. They don't know how campaigns should be developed. So, from that perspective of a very clear customer journey, like I have a system collecting data and I need to generate more revenue, how would you leverage an LLM in that kind of context in ad tech?
It's a fair question, and I would certainly not start with an LLM because that's a very complicated machine that's very tricky to predict its outcomes. And so I would start with math. This happened a lot at Spotify where I'd not have to, but I would be the one to try to compare methods because Spotify as an organization was very committed to machine learning. And so it hired lots and lots of machine learning engineers. And if you hire machine learning engineers, you will get machine learning because that's what they do and that's what you hired them to do. And that's not always the best solution to things. Sometimes it is, sometimes it isn't. And it would be my role to take a given problem and say, all right, what what's the baseline here? Like what can we do with the simplest tools possible? And does that help us understand whether the machine learning is adding value or inscrutability? And I haven't done anything in ad tech. I tried to stay away from advertising as much as I could, but I'm 99.7% sure that the same things would apply there. That in order to have even any sense about whether your LLM things are good, you need to know what are the right answers. Like, are there simple right answers? Are there good answers? Can we get good answers easily and then use those to tell whether our fancy methods are giving us great answers or like average answers? And I think a lot of the time we evaluate new tech against really poor baselines, like against randomness or against the most popular things, or like you said, against just like our intuitive guesses. And in those contexts, sometimes the fancy tools seem like, oh, they're clearly better. But then when you compare them against, oh, what if we just did some math? And you realize, oh, the math's even better and it's a lot simpler and it goes weird in a lot fewer ways. So if it were me, if I had a change of emotional composition and decided to work on ad tech suddenly, that's what I'd do. So I'd start with, all right, where are we now? Where can we get with simple tools? And then we're calibrated and we say, all right, what could be better? And can we get to the betterness with fancy magic? Or is the fancy magic just more fancy than it is magic?
You made a compelling point, which is basically LLMs and just ML and algorithms shouldn't be leveraged for the purpose of prediction. They should be for the purpose of assistive functions, ones where there's a clear target and this can improve the fidelity or the accuracy of the result. From that perspective, where do you think LLMs are well suited to support? Like let's take, for example, in your world, adding taxonomies to music, retagging them, recompiling them, reassociating them, those tags being context aware. Are those good functions for LLMs, or what would you say are good functions?
My feeling is that LLMs in particular at this point are amazingly good at reading. I mean, they're language models. So if you just sort of think about them for a moment, it makes sense that they're really good at reading human text because that's what That's how they've been created. They're pretty good at remembering things, although their notion of memory is a lot different than a human one. And so that's part of why it's good. They are not very good at thinking. That can be hard to realize because they're very good at recalling when people have thought, and it can be tricky to tell the difference between a thing that's thinking and a thing that is recalling good thought that someone else did. They're terrible at writing. They're not good at creating, but they're amazingly good at reading. So for me, most interesting applications start with that, with where is it that we have knowledge represented as human language that it's been hard to convert into just mundane structured data that we can then do things with. And one of the best examples to me is web scraping. Like if you have a page that has a blog post that some band wrote about when their new album is coming out, that's good information. Like that page represents the factual information that this album has a title, it's by this band, and it's coming out on September 24th. And the fans of that band want to know that, and the human fans can find it out by reading that page. And it'd be useful to have that data somewhere too. And getting that data out of a web page with old tools is really hard because it's written in the middle of text. Like you don't want to do it with beautiful soup. You're not going to do it with regex. It's a pain. The best way would have been have a human read the page and then type it into a database. The LM can do that. Like it's amazingly good at that. It can take a page of like weirdly written idioms and mentioning a bunch of releases and pull out the structured data. That is impressive. That's the kind of thing that these tools are really good at. Read some text, distill facts out of it. I mean, remembering is not a trivial part. And so the use of LLMs to basically do searches that map straightforwardly to information that we have, but not the way it's been organized, is another good example. So many things you do in ChatGPT, for example, I think would be better as Google searches. Like you'd like to get an actual authoritative source that explains something. If it's something about how do I apply a JavaScript library to a problem I have, and the problem I have is kind of backwards from the way the JavaScript library is documented. And a Google search would bring me up the documentation for the library, but it wouldn't be obvious to me how to apply it to solve my problem. The LLM, because it has broken that up into sentences and understands them, can give me the explanation I need, which is rearranged the human language, but kind of maintained the human input. I can read it and go, oh, I see. I need to put this thing in the middle of my process and call it in this way. And now I can understand it. So those are great uses and things we have not been able to do before.
So
Having it write me an essay? No, I don't want that. Have it write me a song? Boy, do I not want that. That is not existentially useless to me.
So if we take a step up higher, right? Because, you obviously have been working in and with data for so long. And there's now a lot of designers and researchers who are really having to start working with data and probabilistic interfaces for the first time, or in a meaningful way for the first time. What advice do you have, or what do you believe that they need to know about working with data and probabilistic interfaces to be successful in this new era?
I would start with just a big hug and then say, you don't have to. Like if you get into it and you're like, I don't know how to do this, maybe it's telling you that this is not yet the right solution for your problem. And I think it's really hard if you're trying to make a living in a tech field to say that, to like turn around to your boss who's asked you to figure out, our future relies on embracing AI before our competitors. So you have 3 weeks to figure out how AI is going to transform chocolate chip cookie baking. Like, you better come up with an answer. But I think often the answer is, nah, there's nothing here, or there's something here, but it's like peripheral. We could use it to read our customer emails and distill them in a better way than we have time to. But it's not going to help us bake the cookies. It's hard to be the one who pushes back on a fevered corporate enthusiasm for something. But if you can't do that, then you're probably going to do a bad job of whatever you're trying to figure out. The thing I always say to people, I talk to like college students and they ask, how do careers work? How does this job thing work? And I always tell them the thing to do is find something that you care about, whether it's done well, and you can tell whether it's done well. So if you have those two things, then you will be motivated to learn whatever you need to learn to make it good. And you'll be able to iterate because you can tell whether it's good. And if you don't have either of those things, then you're screwed because you can't tell if you're making progress. And if you don't care, you'll just stop. And if you have to get into AI because someone told you to, but you can't tell whether it's good or not, and you don't care, then it's going to be bad. And you should just not.
Thinking then about how to evaluate if something's working or not, I'd like to go to the piece about how a designer can influence the interface of an algorithm. I use my Spotify a lot. I use a lot of these tools. And one of the areas of design has not been figured out yet are the ways through which a user can use a graphical user interface to train the data set. I know for myself, when I have an algorithmic playlist, a lot of times I'm frustratingly angry and just want to like scrap everything in my profile because I feel like it doesn't know me. I feel like I've lost a friend, but the interface doesn't give me a way to tell it that. What do you believe you as a data person need as inputs from a designer to enable this kind of yin and yang of learn and fail and learn and fail in a methodical, effective way?
Oh, I think the problem is not the designer in that case. The problem is that the product has been set up to do a thing that isn't quite what you actually want. I think you described a sad and common failure mode of algorithmic technology, which is that you what you ultimately want is them helping you do your things. And instead, what you've got is a thing that is helping the business accomplish the business things. And those are not quite aligned. Sometimes they're close enough that you can kind of pretend to not notice that for a while, and it rarely holds up for very long. So by the time your Spotify algorithm has gone awry, as people put it, it was awry to begin with. Like, Discover Weekly, it's a very successful product, but it doesn't make sense. It treats you as if you are one blob of taste and tries to find more of that blob of taste. And if you are, in fact, one blob of taste, if you only like one thing, and the other people who like that thing only like that thing, then it works great. But if either of those things are wrong, then it's not so great. It uses vector embeddings, which turn the world into this one space and then try to navigate in it. But if you like Belgian hip hop and California surf rock equally, then your place in that space is somewhere between those two, which is something else entirely. And going back to Daily Mix, that was the opposite approach. It was, don't try to average you, try to separate your things so that each one of them can be a jumping off point for exploration. Discover Weekly is far from the only thing like this. Your recommendations in any algorithmic platform are probably going to experience this effect unless you have a software where the people have really embraced the idea that the algorithms are trying to help the people instead of the business,
My
trying to
YouTube
organize.
notifications are abysmal. Same reason, they're trying to average me out and assume that what I listened to last week is me, but usually I was on it by accident. Everything that I collected online, there's a different purpose for it, and they don't understand the intent. And without understanding the intent, they don't know how to serve it and how to prioritize it, right?
Right, because it's not just that you have different areas of taste. It's they mean different things to you, and you interact with them in different ways. So you like Belgian hip hop and you like California surf rock, but the California surf rock is like comfort music, and all you ever want to hear is the greatest surf rock of all time. You're not interested in the new songs by those bands if they're even still existing. Whereas Belgian hip hop, you want to hear the newest stuff and only the newest stuff. So not only is the averaging losing you in the space between those two styles, but it's losing you in the mode space between what you need. In Spotify Wrapped a few years ago, we did this thing called the listening personality, and it was a Myers-Briggs style 4-character breakdown of the way you listen to music independent of what music it is. And it was Wrapped, so it was presented as a shareable thing. And product goal of Wrapped is virality and brand marketing. But the data, I'd done that, and the data for it was real, and I've been working on it for years. And my goal of having that data was to have a framework for the humans and the algorithms to communicate, to be able to express what is it that's different about my California surf rock needs versus my Belgian hip hop needs. And it's in one, I want familiarity and popular validation, only the classics. And in one, I want newness and genre coherence. And in one, I'm happy to have the same artist play over and over again. And in one, I want variety. So these 4 dimensions of listening were an attempt to phrase those such that you as a human could override them. That you could have a way of talking to the algorithm to say, all right, today, uh, I usually want the newest stuff in Belgian hip hop, but today just like play me my favorites. Or today, I'm willing to hear if there's any new California surf rock. But it's a vastly different model than hold still and we'll tell you what to listen to next. And it implies a lot more agency on the part of the listener. And so far at this juncture of technology, agency is not usually the goal. And I think this applies to the artist side of in music too. Spotify for Artists has a lot of good information. It does not have a lot of powerful decision making that you as an artist can do. And when Spotify introduced discovery mode, this was sort of a good example. Discovery mode, you as an artist have the opportunity to opt in. So your agency is, I can push the button that says okay. And when I do that, that says, all right, Spotify can do a bunch of magic that's under Spotify's control to try to give me more plays in return for lower royalties. But for me, what I wanted Spotify to do in something like that was give the artist more power. Not just ask them to submit to magic, but if you're an artist, your next song, it's a ballad and you usually do, jams. And so you would be able to say, all right, this next song, I think it'd be better pushed to this segment of my fans, the fans that I share with Celine Dion, not the ones that I share with the Foo Fighters, or whatever it is. That seems more interesting to me, giving the artist more tools to try to accomplish something they want to do, as opposed to just giving even more control to algorithms.
I think that that's so important and interesting. And, you said earlier on in this conversation that often we'll evaluate based on poor baselines as well. And so let's talk about evaluating success. Let's talk about understanding, especially as we're going into this new space and we have product teams that are trying to implement generative AI. Many are struggling to make the tech work the way that they need to, or struggling to find that proper use case. What should these product teams be concerned with to make these implementations meaningfully successful?
So I think it's all, to me, can you generate results that you can evaluate? And this was one of the things that allowed me to feel like I was doing a good job at Spotify. If I was working on algorithmic playlist generation, I would generate playlists. I would generate them in a lot of different seeds, whether they're artist based or genre based or whatever. And I would look at them, and I would look at 50 of them side by side, and I would take whatever time it took to get to the point where I could evaluate them. So I would be like, all right, I'm supposed to be generating German hip hop now. What do I know about German hip hop? Well, start the stopwatch. Nothing. Okay, here's a list. All right, I studied German for 2 years in high school, so I can look at these names and have some idea whether are any of these, does this look German at all? Okay, it looks sort of German. Good. So let's take the top 3 and do some Google research. Like, this is music. It's a real thing. The world's full of it. Let's go find out who are the top rappers in Germany. Are these them? And 15 minutes later, I'm like, all right, now I know a little bit about German hip hop. And it helps that I've done this a lot. So it's not like I have to have explained to me like what German is or what hip hop is. And the more you do this, the more you learn that it's actually pretty, it takes a lifetime to learn the deep nuances of anything, but it doesn't take very long to get a sense of whether things are sort of right or totally wrong. And so if you can do that, then it doesn't matter what technology you're employing. You could be employing the most fallible, weird, randomness producing machines, but if you can evaluate the results and then you can iterate and you can see if they get better, then at least you have something you can do. And the worst case in the other extreme is if you can't evaluate, and this is why I tell people that you have to do something where you care and can tell whether it's good. If you can't evaluate, then you have to wait for it to be done for you. And that is incredibly slow. So if you don't know, if you look at that list and you like, I don't know if this is good German hip hop and I'm unwilling to find out, then the thing you do is you schedule a user test. And that user test can't be run for another 3 months because it's lined up behind all these other user tests that conflict with the seed assignments. And once it's run, it has to wait for the data science team to evaluate the P numbers, the results, and decide whether it's powered or not. And then something goes wrong and you have to run it again. And if it takes you 6 months to get an answer about whether your current iteration is good, then to do 10 iterations, we've moved on to brain implants and it doesn't matter anymore.
I would also argue that I think as an industry, we also just need to get better at doing user testing that doesn't require so many parameters around it as well. But
that fair point. But anything in the gap between I can run it in 30 seconds and look at the results myself and then change something and run it again, and I have to schedule a test that takes 6 months and 5 teams to get me an answer that is maybe still not what I need. There's a lot of variables in between that. But the closer you are to, I can tell if it's good or bad, and I can iterate and tell if it's better, then the more weirdness that you can take on and have a hope of telling whether it's good or not. So
Can we dive into that a bit more? Because I'm
yeah,
very interested in it. Like, let's take, for example, Brittany and I, we went to an AI event in Toronto, and there was somebody presenting an LLM that evaluates your lawyer documents and centralizes. It's easy to have an accuracy percentage as an evaluative metric. But let's say we met somebody who was building a startup that was generating a resume for you. How can you build evaluative metrics into something where either the evaluator is at arm's reach, in this case, like the employer, or where it's highly subjective and highly emotional and highly irrational? How can you build that evaluativeness into it?
Well, the answer in some cases is you can't, or it's really hard to, and then that implies that this is going to be a tough application of that technology. So, yeah, I think sometimes it's just, yeah, that's good luck. I mean, you could try that, but it's going to be hard. So, using LLMs to generate implementations of Python functions with given definitions and given inputs and outputs, yeah, we can do that. Like, it's got to be able to do this, and you're going to run a test at the end, and it passes or fails. Great. That's not subjective. It's going to work or it's not going to work. Generate a resume. I mean, the test there is, does this person get hired? We can't run that test 1,000 times like we can run the Python functions. So that's going to be hard. I think using LLMs to do dating matches, maybe it would work, but yeah, it's going to be hard to test. And so if you take on something where it's hard to test, that's a different thing. You're going to have something other than testing that you can rely on, whether it's your intuition or really good user testing, some really good method for user testing, some other way to get confidence, or some reason why the confidence doesn't matter. In some LM applications like Midjourney, so in generating images from text, I think we're at the point where that's in some sense not very good, but is being evaluated at the moment sort of on amusement value. Like
Yeah.
it's not for functional purposes. Like if I were trying to use it to generate needs for images, I'm sort of speculating that such a thing exists. But if I had needed a specific image that didn't exist, but it would be reasonable that it did, it would be hard to use current AI image generation tools for that, and hard to evaluate and hard to test. But if all I have to do is like, it has to look funny, like, all right, I need Kamala Harris as a communist orator. Like, okay, here's a picture, and it conveys that idea.
Thankfully, Twitter does that for you for free now. But you're obviously very knowledgeable on music. And if we were to build a renegade startup in the music world, and we're going to say it's AI powered because that's what the investors need, what would that music agent do? How would you evaluate whether it's working or not? I'm asking this because, again, we've all been embedded in the streaming world, and the definition of a good listen is hard to know because is a good listen if you've listened to the whole thing through? Is it that you saved it? Is it that you followed the person? Is it that you listened all the way through? Does that mean that you just were checked out and you're just not even caring about the music? How do you evaluate success with this kind of world? Because there's tons of data in music, but it's hard to know which data means what.
My favorite success metric for music things was returning to them over time. I use this for just everything, not never mind AI or algorithms or not. Just like, does a listener like an artist? The most straightforward way is to add up the time or the number of plays. And like you say, neither of those are necessarily true. And I think you see this in Spotify Wrapped. Sometimes you get to the end of the year and be like, my favorite song was that song. I don't even remember that song. And then you think about it and you're like, oh, wait, yes, I left my phone in my pocket on loop by accident when I left it in the car and it went to the beach in June, and that song played 85 times before I came back to the car and realized it. But that wasn't my favorite song. But if you come back to that repeatedly every day for a week or every few weeks all year, that's a much better sign. And that's true for artists, at any level of abstraction. If you play songs from the same genre, different artists in the same genre, but repeatedly over time. It's a pretty good sign that you're actually interested in that genre. You return to a playlist, editorial playlist, another user's playlist over time. It's a good sign. That is usually how I evaluate things. Now, the tricky part of that is that's really easy to evaluate over historical data. It's harder to evaluate in a user test, which are usually limited in time. So you're like, all right, I have 7 days. Did they come back to it during the 7 days? And then that's only really good if they encountered it early in the 7 days.
I fundamentally disagree with what
Oh,
you're saying
cool.
about that, because I think that we're in this time in the world where people are over relying on data or giving it an over strength credibility, right? And you said several times that a lot of the data is lacking context, or the algorithms are lacking context to be able to know what to do about it. And I believe that you probably have just had too siloed an experience of user research, because there are so many ways that data and user research can collaborate better. So for example, if you had come and said, hey, we're seeing that these people are returning back to this data over and over again, I, as a user researcher, I don't need to then have them do a diary study where, they go back to that exact same thing in that time. We can look at historically what's been happening and have conversations that are deeper and more meaningful with them about when they're listening to different things and what's happening. And I think that there's just this fundamental divergence right now where we need to come back to a place where I think user research and data are working more collaboratively, and I think more transparently, where we're each influencing each other's work and we're able to then strengthen the user research but strengthen the data as well. And so I guess my question to you is, if you were in a space where that collaboration was happening more meaningfully, how would you want to engage with the user research or with the user testing in that perspective to give you the strongest ammo to then make a case and say, hey, we do need to segregate these playlists, or we do need to create different profiles for these users within the algorithms, things like that?
To me, the key difference there is between user research and user testing. And I was thrilled with every time we ever did actual user research, like actual user researchers, humans were involved in interacting with human listeners. That always produced fascinating insights, invariably. Most user tests, and this was true at Spotify, and I'm certain it's true at most tech companies, are not user research, don't involve user researchers, don't involve personal interaction. They are A/B tests. We fed 2 different algorithms to 2 different randomly selected populations. No one talked to them. No one told them that it was happening. All we have is data. So when I said that's what I'm talking about with the limitations of user tests. If a person had gone and talked to them, yes, like you can get the insight you need by talking to people based on no data, let alone a little bit of data. But if you subject people to that anonymous secret A/B test for 7 days, then that's enough for some things. It's not enough for a lot of things.
Yeah, I think we have our work cut out for us in terms of how do we redefine user research and engagement and data collection.
A few months ago, we spoke with Martin Walraven from MusicX, their community that's exploring the economics and broader system of the music industry and looking at experimental ways of engaging. And we also spoke with Virginie Berger from Matchtune about AI, and the sentiment's really negative. It's very pessimistic. The value of music is going down. Rights holders are losing out. Things are being trained illegally. Do you have anything optimistic that you feel is happening in music as a result of this technological surge? Is there anything that you see that are good signals? Any happy stories?
Well, I think the same thing as I think when people bemoan the economic status of music and say sort of reasonably with remuneration this low, there'll be no future generations. No one can afford to make music anymore. And I looked at that, and then I turn around and look at music, and I'm like, except there's more music than ever, and it's just as good and more varied than ever. So maybe that's not quite what's happening. And I'm fundamentally optimistic about technology in general. But at the beginning, I think the first few LLM things, I felt this chill of like, just that horror go through me, especially with music generation. Like the idea that text prompts to songs is the future, and that people will be listening to algorithmically generated music that's their perfect thing. That idea of a future, that's brains in vats to me, and that's not what humanity is here for. But for that same reason, I don't imagine that happening. I don't think anybody is going to be pleased with AI generated music for the same reason that I don't think it solves any problem, because that's not what we do with music as humans. It's not
It
like
seems
air
that
conditioning. It's not like there's a perfect body temperature, there's a perfect emotional temperature, and we're just trying to reach it. Music is a communal experience. Like, we experience it together. We use it to communicate with each other about what it's like to be human and feel things. And the AI is not part of that. I think there were the same fears at every stage of technology. We had synthesizers.
it seems if you look at it holistically, though, what's happened with tech is it's reduced the barrier to be a musician, but it's also reduced the barrier to be a music fan. And if there are no more barriers, if there's no more friction left, then does any of it matter? If anyone can listen to anything at any time with no restrictions, and if anybody can create music at any time with no restrictions, is it still a craft? That's the philosophical question.
What does it mean for it to be a craft, and what matters about that is, I think, the core. So I think you take it back to, we invented synthesizers, and suddenly you could make violin noises without learning to play the violin. So it's the same kind of thing. Like, you had this craft that you needed to learn, and we'd sort of assumed that that learning was a necessary part of the value. And then that got questioned, and a bunch of people were afraid of it. Like, no one's ever going to learn how to play the violin again because they don't have to. But it didn't happen. People still learned to play the violin. We'd learn to do other things with synthesizers than just pretend that they're violins. And there's a lot of great music with synthesized violins, and there's a lot of great music with violins. And I think we're not yet to that point with AI as a category of using it as a tool. I think we'll get there, because we won't be satisfied until we do. And so I'm not really worried that it's going to be a Borgesian library problem where every possible sound exists and there's no way to distinguish between them, and we are just stuck listening to a feed of AI muttering, because no one actually wants that.
Glenn, it's been an absolute pleasure speaking with you. I have
Fun.
loved how divergent we've been from what we thought we'd be talking about. We learned a lot about the philosophy of data and this really critical context about being able to measure it, being able to understand why we're doing it, being able to care about the outcomes.
I'm skeptical. I'm curious. I think that's the key tension. Don't do things because you think you have to, but also don't be afraid of them. And trying things is how you find out that what works, even when what works is not what you thought would work or what someone told you to build.